From the endless steppes of Mongolia emerged a force that would reshape the world. Under the command of Genghis Khan, the Mongol horde gathered at dawn, their warhorses restless with anticipation. The vast army stretched across the horizon like a dark tide, each warrior carrying the weight of destiny. They had conquered countless tribes, but today would test their legendary reputation against an enemy that refused to bow. The Khan raised his arm, and silence fell upon the assembled thousands. This battle would either cement their myth or shatter it forever. The great city of Zhongdu stood as the last bastion of the Jin dynasty, its walls having never fallen to any army. For months, the Mongols had laid siege to its gates, but the Chinese defenders fought with desperate courage. Inside the walls, families huddled in fear while soldiers prepared for the inevitable assault. The Khan knew that breaching these fortifications would require more than brute force. His warriors had earned their fearsome reputation through speed and cunning, not prolonged sieges. Yet something about this city stirred unease in the normally confident Mongol leader. Perhaps it was the silence that emanated from within the walls, or the way the defenders watched from above like statues. Genghis Khan had never known defeat, yet standing before Zhongdu's walls, something felt different. The silence from within the city gnawed at his confidence like never before. His warriors looked to him for guidance, expecting the same fearless leader who had united the tribes and conquered nations. But for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. What if the legends were wrong? What if these walls could not be breached? He pushed the thoughts aside, knowing his people needed strength. The Khan's reputation was built on victory, and he would not let uncertainty cloud his judgment. Yet deep within, a small voice whispered warnings that he couldn't ignore. As the Mongol forces prepared their siege equipment, the unexpected happened. The massive gates of Zhongdu swung open, and the Chinese army marched out to meet them in open battle. This was unprecedented. No Chinese force had ever willingly left the protection of their walls to face the Mongol horde. The disciplined ranks advanced with perfect synchronization, their armor gleaming in the morning light. Genghis Khan's eyes narrowed as he watched this display of confidence. Either the Chinese commander was supremely confident in his army's abilities, or this was an elaborate trap designed to draw the Mongols into a killing field. The Khan had faced many enemies, but never one so bold as to challenge him on his own terms. The two armies faced each other across the windswept plain, each representing vastly different approaches to warfare. The Mongol cavalry formed loose, flexible formations, their horses restless and warriors ready to strike from any angle. Across from them, the Chinese infantry stood in rigid, geometric patterns that had served their ancestors for centuries. Spear points gleamed like a forest of steel, while archers waited behind protective shields. Neither side moved immediately, each commander studying the other's disposition. The Chinese had abandoned their walls, placing everything on this single engagement. The Mongols had the advantage of mobility, but the Chinese possessed discipline and numbers. As the wind picked up dust from the plain, both armies prepared for a battle that would echo through history. Among the Mongol ranks stood Batu, a young warrior experiencing his first major battle. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his bow, the same weapon his father had carried to victory. Stories of Mongol invincibility had been told around countless fires, but now reality faced him across the battlefield. The Chinese army looked formidable, their discipline intimidating even to seasoned warriors. He glanced at the veterans around him, searching for reassurance in their weathered faces. They had followed the Khan across half the known world, conquering everything in their path. But this was different. The young warrior wondered if the legends were real or simply stories told to inspire courage. As the morning mist swirled around them, he tightened his grip on his bow and prepared to discover the truth. General Wang stood surveying the battlefield from his elevated position, confident in his strategic decision to meet the Mongols in open combat. Years of military training had prepared him for this moment, and his forces represented the finest soldiers in the empire. The abandonment of Zhongdu's walls had been controversial, but Wang knew that fighting on open ground would neutralize the Mongol advantage of speed and mobility. His disciplined ranks would hold their formation regardless of the enemy's tactics. He had studied the Mongol campaigns and understood their methods. While they excelled at hit-and-run attacks and psychological warfare, they had never faced an army with such rigid discipline and superior numbers. As he watched the enemy forces through his spyglass, Wang smiled. Today, the myth of Mongol invincibility would end. As the signal horns echoed across the plain, both armies began their advance toward inevitable collision. The Mongol cavalry formed crescent-shaped formations, their horses galloping with the wind while archers prepared to unleash deadly volleys. Across the field, the Chinese infantry moved forward in perfect synchronization, their spear points creating a wall of steel that advanced with mechanical precision. The contrast between chaos and order played out in slow motion as the two forces closed distance. Individual moments of human drama emerged from the mass, a young soldier saying a prayer, a veteran checking his blade one final time, a commander shouting last-minute instructions. The ground trembled beneath thousands of feet and hooves, and the air grew thick with tension. Soon, the myth of Mongol invincibility would be tested against the finest army in the known world. The first arrows flew like deadly rain across the battlefield, and the myth of Mongol superiority faced its greatest test. Mongol archers unleashed their famous volleys, sending death whistling through the air toward the Chinese formations. But the disciplined infantry held their ground, raising shields and returning fire with equal precision. When the arrows gave way to steel, the real battle began. Mongol horsemen crashed into Chinese lines, their curved swords flashing in the sunlight as they sought to break the enemy's rigid formations. For the first time in their legendary campaigns, the Mongols faced resistance that didn't crumble at their approach. Chinese warriors fought with desperate courage, their superior numbers and armor beginning to tell. The myth that had swept across Asia suddenly seemed less certain as warriors fell on both sides, and the battle raged with unprecedented ferocity. For the first time in his legendary career, Genghis Khan found himself struggling against an equal opponent. The Chinese general he faced was no trembling provincial commander, but a warrior of considerable skill and courage. Their swords clashed repeatedly, each strike sending sparks flying and testing the mettle of both fighters. The Khan's usual confidence wavered as his opponent pressed him relentlessly, forcing him to defend rather than attack. Around them, the battle raged with unprecedented intensity, but neither warrior paid attention to anything beyond their personal duel. The myth of Mongol invincibility seemed to hang in the balance of this single combat. If the Khan fell here, his entire empire might crumble. Yet if he triumphed, perhaps the legend could be restored. Sweat and blood mixed on his face as he fought to prove that the stories were true. The Chinese army's perfect formations, which had inspired such confidence in their commander, proved to be their greatest weakness. As Mongol horsemen struck at vulnerable points, the rigid discipline that had seemed so formidable began to crack. Warriors who had trained for years to maintain their positions found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by the Mongols' fluid tactics. Officers shouted desperate orders, trying to reorganize their troops, but the chaos of battle made communication nearly impossible. The myth of Chinese superiority in open combat crumbled as gaps appeared in their lines, and Mongol warriors poured through like water finding cracks in stone. Yet even as their formations broke apart, many Chinese soldiers continued to fight with the same courage that had initially impressed their enemies. The battle was far from over, but the advantage had shifted decisively toward the Mongols. Young Bata found himself surrounded by two veteran Chinese warriors, their superior armor and coordinated attacks pressing him hard. His horse had fallen early in the engagement, leaving him to fight on foot against opponents who clearly had more experience. The stories his elders had told around the fire seemed distant now, as he struggled to parry blows from both sides. Each strike of their weapons tested his skill and courage, and he wondered if this was how the great Mongol warriors had felt in their final moments. The myth of invincibility felt hollow as steel rang against steel, and he realized that he was fighting not for glory or empire, but simply to survive. Yet something deeper than fear drove him forward, the knowledge that his people's very identity hung in the balance. If the Mongols could be defeated here, if they could bleed and fall like ordinary men, then everything they believed about themselves would crumble. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had seemed so uncertain just hours before, now proved its terrible reality. Chinese formations that had stood so confidently against the enemy were now breaking apart in chaos and retreat. Mongol horsemen pursued the fleeing soldiers with their characteristic ruthlessness, cutting down anyone who slowed or stumbled. The Chinese commander watched in horror from his hilltop position as his carefully planned battle dissolved into rout. His elaborate robes, which had symbolized imperial authority just that morning, now seemed like a mockery as his army scattered like autumn leaves before the wind. The disciplined soldiers who had marched out of Zhongdu's gates with such confidence now threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. The myth that had swept across Asia was no longer just stories told around fires, it was blood and steel made manifest on the battlefield. General Wang stared in disbelief as his army, which had marched out with such confidence just hours before, now scattered in complete rout across the battlefield. His carefully laid plans, his years of military study, his confidence in Chinese superiority, all of it crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. The Mongols, whom he had dismissed as barbarians relying on luck and ferocity, had proven themselves masters of tactics and strategy. His elaborate armor, which had seemed so impressive that morning, now felt like a costume in a play where the script had gone completely wrong. The commander realized with growing horror that he had made a catastrophic error in abandoning Zhongdu's walls. Now his army was destroyed, his reputation ruined, and his emperor's trust betrayed. As Mongol warriors crested the hill and spotted his position, Wang understood that the myth of Mongol invincibility was not just stories, it was reality written in blood. As the sun began to set over the battlefield, Genghis Khan stood triumphant among the bodies of his enemies, his sword raised high in victory. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had seemed so uncertain at dawn, now proved itself undeniable. His warriors cheered around him, their voices carrying across the field where Chinese soldiers had fought so bravely just hours before. The commander who had dared to challenge them in open combat now sat in chains, his elaborate plans reduced to nothing more than another footnote in Mongol history. Zhongdu's gates, which had seemed so bold when opened that morning, now stood as symbols of surrender and defeat. The Khan lowered his sword and looked out over his victory, knowing that this battle would be remembered not as the moment when the myth was tested, but as the moment when it was proven beyond all doubt. The Mongol tide would continue its sweep across the world, and no army would stand against it. Young Bata leaned against his wounded horse, his first taste of major battle finally over. The stories his elders had told around countless fires now seemed both true and terrifying. He had survived not because he was invincible, but because he had fought with courage and skill that surprised even himself. The myth of Mongol superiority had been tested today, and while it had ultimately proven true, Batu understood now that it was earned through blood and sacrifice, not granted by birth or destiny. His hands still trembled slightly as he gripped his sword, but they no longer shook with fear, they shook with the knowledge that he had proven himself worthy of the name Mongol. As the sun set over the battlefield, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Bata realized that he was no longer the frightened youth who had ridden out that morning. He was a warrior, and the myth that had seemed so uncertain at dawn now flowed through his veins like fire. The Chinese army that had marched out of Zhongdu's gates with such confidence now fled back toward those same walls in complete chaos and terror. Officers who had issued crisp commands that morning now shouted desperately to organize a retreat that was already beyond control. Soldiers threw away their carefully maintained armor and weapons, anything that might slow their escape from the pursuing Mongol horsemen. The gates that had represented bold defiance just hours before now seemed like the only barrier between them and complete annihilation. Civilians on the walls watched in horror as their army, which had been their last hope of protection, dissolved into a mass of fleeing men. The disciplined formation that had inspired such confidence was now nothing more than scattered individuals, each fighting for their own survival. The myth of Chinese military superiority lay broken on the battlefield behind them, and the survivors could only hope that their city's walls would prove stronger than their army's courage. General Wang walked in chains through the dust of his own defeat, his elaborate armor now seeming like a cruel joke. The same robes that had made him a symbol of Chinese military might now dragged behind him in the dirt, torn and stained by battle. Mongol warriors guarded him closely, their expressions showing both triumph at their victory and contempt for the commander who had dared to challenge their superiority. His staff officers followed behind, equally bound and broken, their fine silks now worthless against Mongol steel. As they approached Zhongdu's gates, Wang could see the chaos of his army's retreat and understood that his bold decision to meet the Mongols in open battle had been catastrophic. The city that had seemed so secure behind its walls now faced the full fury of an army that knew no defeat. His capture marked not just personal failure, but the end of Chinese resistance in this region. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been tested and proven true, while the myth of Chinese superiority had crumbled into dust. Zhongdu's gates began to close even as the last Chinese soldiers struggled to reach safety, their desperate cries echoing off the stone walls. Mongol horsemen pressed close behind, their arrows finding targets among the fleeing soldiers and their war cries filling the air with terror. Chinese civilians crowded the walls above, watching in horror as their army's final collapse unfolded below them. The gates themselves showed damage from the day's battle, and the mechanisms for closing them groaned and protested under the strain. Desperate soldiers threw themselves against the barriers, begging to be let in, while others attempted to scale the walls with makeshift ropes and grappling hooks. Mongol warriors formed a loose siege line around the city, their bows ready and their horses pawing the ground with impatience. The setting sun cast long shadows across the scene of chaos and desperation, illuminating the final moments of Chinese resistance before the inevitable fall of Zhongdu. Genghis Khan watched from his hilltop position as Zhongdu's gates slammed shut, trapping the last remnants of Chinese resistance within the walls they had so confidently abandoned that morning. His expression showed satisfaction at the day's victory, but his calculating eyes were already turning toward the challenges that lay ahead. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been proven true on the open field, but could it withstand the test of siege warfare against determined defenders? The defeated Chinese commander sat in chains nearby, serving as a stark reminder of the price of challenging the Khan's authority. Mongol officers gathered around their leader, receiving orders for the siege that would now begin in earnest. As the sun continued to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed to reflect the blood spilled that day, the Khan understood that this victory was merely the beginning. The myth that had been tested and proven on the battlefield would now face its greatest challenge yet, the walls of Zhongdu itself. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the Mongol army began its encirclement of Zhongdu with the same methodical precision that had won them victory in the field. Campfires appeared like stars around the city's perimeter, marking where veteran warriors made camp and prepared for the siege to come. Mongol engineers worked by torchlight, assembling the siege equipment that would soon test the walls that had never fallen. Inside the city, Chinese defenders lit their own torches and lanterns, creating a ring of desperate light around the walls they now desperately needed to hold. The contrast between the disciplined Mongol preparations and the chaotic Chinese defense efforts was stark. The attackers knew exactly what they were doing, while the defenders scrambled to organize their last stand. Individual moments of human drama played out in the darkness, warriors sharpening blades by firelight, soldiers reinforcing walls with whatever materials they could find, officers trying to maintain order among troops who had just witnessed their army's complete destruction. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been proven in battle, but now it would face the ultimate test of siege warfare. Young Bata stood guard at the Mongol siege lines, his face now bearing the hard expression of a veteran despite his youth. The day's battle had transformed him from an uncertain warrior into a confident guardian of Mongol superiority. He held his bow ready, watching the towering walls of Zhongdu for any sign of weakness or movement that might indicate the defenders' intentions. Around him, other Mongol warriors rested and prepared for the challenges that the siege would bring. Some tended to their horses, ensuring they would be ready for quick movements when needed, while others maintained their weapons with the same methodical precision that had won them victory earlier that day. The city walls rose behind him like a challenge, their height and thickness reminding everyone that the myth of Mongol invincibility had not yet been proven against stone and mortar. Chinese defenders moved along the battlements above, their torches creating dancing shadows that seemed to mock the besiegers below. Batu understood that tomorrow would test not just their military skills, but the very foundation of Mongol legend itself. Dawn broke over Zhongdu as Chinese defenders scrambled to prepare for the siege that would determine their city's fate. Warriors manned the battlements with bows and spears, while civilians helped reinforce weak points in the walls with whatever materials they could find. The contrast with the Mongol siege lines was stark, where the attackers moved with disciplined precision, the defenders worked with desperate urgency. Smoke rose from within the city as forges worked to prepare weapons and the population prepared for the long ordeal ahead. Mongol siege equipment stood ready around the perimeter, their construction reflecting the same engineering skills that had built an empire across Asia. Chinese officers shouted orders from the walls, trying to organize defenses while maintaining morale among troops who had witnessed their army's complete destruction just the day before. Civilians prayed at shrines along the walls, their whispered pleas echoing off the stone as they asked for protection from the barbarian horde below. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been proven in open battle, but now it would face the ultimate test of patience and engineering against walls that had never fallen. A young mother clutched her child to her chest as she watched the Mongol siege preparations from Zhongdu's walls, her face reflecting both terror and determination. The stories told about these barbarians had seemed like distant legends until yesterday, when her husband had marched out with the army and never returned. Now she stood on the same walls that had protected the city for generations, wondering if they would prove strong enough against the force that had swept across half the known world. Behind her, other civilians worked alongside soldiers, carrying stones and supplies to reinforce the defenses with the same desperate energy that had characterized the entire morning's preparations. Her child looked out with wide, innocent eyes, too young to understand that their comfortable life was about to be tested by forces beyond imagination. The mother kissed the top of her child's head and whispered prayers to ancestors who had built these walls, hoping that the myth of Mongol invincibility was just that, myth, and that the stone and mortar of Zhongdu would prove stronger than barbarian steel. The first Mongol siege engines rolled toward Zhongdu's walls with the same inexorable determination that had carried them across continents. Massive wooden towers and battering rams moved slowly but steadily, pushed by teams of warriors and horses whose discipline reflected years of conquest. Chinese defenders lined the walls above, preparing to meet this assault with every weapon at their disposal. Arrows were nocked, stones positioned for dropping, and cauldrons of boiling oil readied for the moment when the enemy came within range. The scale of the siege equipment spoke to the Mongol commitment to this assault. This was not a casual attack, but a systematic effort to reduce the walls that had never fallen. Dust rose from the movement of the massive machines, and the morning sun cast dramatic shadows that emphasized both the engineering prowess of the attackers and the desperate situation of the defenders. Mongol engineers checked every mechanism with professional precision, knowing that any failure could cost lives and delay victory. Chinese officers coordinated their defenses with growing urgency, while civilians watched from the walls with the knowledge that their comfortable lives hung in the balance. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been proven in battle, but now it would be tested against stone and mortar. The first assault on Zhongdu's walls erupted in a storm of blood and fire that would have impressed even the most veteran Mongol warriors. Siege ladders crashed against the stone as warriors climbed toward their destiny, only to be met by defenders who poured boiling oil and dropped stones with desperate precision. Arrows flew in both directions, turning the walls into a killing field where neither side held clear advantage. Mongol warriors wielding axes hacked at wooden gates while Chinese soldiers thrust spears from defensive positions, each combatant fighting for their very survival. Civilians threw whatever they could find at the attackers: pots, tools, even furniture, anything that might slow the inexorable Mongol advance. Siege towers provided elevated platforms for Mongol archers, who rained death down on defenders with the same skill that had won them victories across Asia. The city's walls showed damage from the assault, with broken stones and scorch marks testifying to the fury of combat. Morning light filtered through the smoke of battle, creating a hellish atmosphere where the myth of Mongol invincibility faced its greatest test yet, not against armies in the field, but against the walls of a determined city. Genghis Khan watched the assault on Zhongdu's walls with mixed emotions that few of his warriors could understand. Pride swelled in his chest as he witnessed Mongol courage in the face of desperate resistance, but concern gnawed at his mind as casualty reports came in from the siege engines. His own face bore fresh scratches from the day's fighting, and his armor showed new dents that spoke to the intensity of combat. Mongol officers reported the assault's progress with professional precision, their expressions reflecting both pride in their warriors' performance and worry at the cost of victory. The city walls still stood despite the furious assault, their defenders fighting with a desperation that surprised even the Khan. Chinese soldiers threw themselves into battle with courage that rivaled Mongol ferocity, and civilians joined the defense with the same determination that had built their empire. The Khan understood that this siege might prove more challenging than anticipated, not because his warriors lacked skill or courage, but because the defenders of Zhongdu refused to accept the myth of Mongol invincibility. As smoke rose from the continuing assault and the sun beat down on the scene of ongoing combat, he wondered if the walls that had never fallen would finally test the limits of Mongol legend. The aftermath of the first assault on Zhongdu's walls revealed both the cost of Mongol ambition and the resilience of Chinese determination. Mongol warriors regrouped with characteristic discipline, tending to their wounded with the same efficiency that had carried them across Asia, while engineers worked to repair damaged siege equipment. Broken siege ladders lay scattered at the base of the walls like the bones of defeated giants, and the ground ran red with the blood of warriors from both sides. Chinese defenders above threw down the bodies of fallen attackers with grim determination, reinforcing their positions while civilians helped carry water to warriors and supplies to defensive positions. The contrast between Mongol discipline and Chinese desperation was stark, where the attackers regrouped with methodical precision, the defenders worked with frantic energy born of survival instinct. The city walls still stood, but showed significant damage from the assault that spoke to the fury of combat. Individual moments of human drama played out across the scene, wounded warriors being tended by comrades, officers giving orders with voices hoarse from shouting, civilians praying at makeshift shrines for protection from the barbarian horde. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been proven in open battle, but now it faced the ultimate test of patience and persistence against walls that refused to fall. Young Bada worked with practiced efficiency to tend his wounded comrade, his hands moving with the same precision that his father had taught him around countless fires. The glory and excitement that had driven him that morning had been replaced by the grim reality of war, blood, pain, and the constant threat of death. Other wounded warriors lay nearby, some groaning in pain while others maintained the stoic silence that Mongol culture demanded even in suffering. Chinese defenders still manned their positions above, refusing to surrender despite the temporary lull in fighting that allowed the Mongols to tend their wounded. The city walls rose behind them like a challenge, their height emphasizing the ongoing struggle between Mongol ambition and Chinese determination. Evening light filtered through the scene, casting long shadows that highlighted both the cost of victory and the determination to continue fighting. Batu understood now that war was not about the stories told around fires or the glory that elders claimed, but about survival, duty, and the willingness to face death for something greater than oneself. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been tested and proven, but it was earned through sacrifice and suffering, not granted by birth or destiny. Night fell over Zhongdu as both armies prepared for the next phase of their deadly struggle, each side illuminated by the flickering light of torches and campfires that turned the darkness into a patchwork of preparation and vigilance. Chinese defenders maintained their watch along the walls with the same desperate determination that had characterized their efforts since dawn, their torches creating dancing shadows that seemed to mock the attackers below. Mongol siege lines showed the same disciplined preparations that had won them victory after victory across Asia, with warriors checking weapons and siege equipment standing ready for another assault. The contrast between the two approaches was stark, where Mongol preparations reflected years of conquest and professional military discipline. Chinese efforts showed the frantic energy of a people fighting for their very survival. Individual moments of human drama played out in the torchlight, Mongol warriors checking their weapons with methodical precision, Chinese soldiers sharing food and water with comrades who might not live to see another dawn, civilians praying at makeshift shrines for protection from the barbarian horde. The city's towers rose into the night sky like challenges to the stars themselves, their height emphasizing the ongoing struggle between Mongol ambition and Chinese determination. As stars shone overhead, witness to the ongoing struggle between two great civilizations, both armies understood that tomorrow's assault would determine not just the fate of Zhongdu, but the continued validity of the myth that had swept across half the known world. Dawn brought the second Mongol assault against Zhongdu's walls with renewed fury that would have impressed even the most veteran warriors. Siege towers rolled toward the battered defenses while massive battering rams crashed against the gates with thunderous impacts that shook the very foundations of the ancient city. Mongol archers in the towers rained death down on defenders who returned fire with equal determination, turning the walls into a killing field where neither side held clear advantage. Individual combat scenes erupted across the assault. Mongol warriors climbed ladders under withering arrow fire while Chinese soldiers poured boiling oil on attackers who came within range, and civilians threw stones and whatever they could find from the walls above. The city's walls showed increased damage from the previous day's assault, with sections breached and towers damaged by the relentless Mongol engineering. Morning light created dramatic shadows across the scene of renewed combat, highlighting both the courage of the defenders and the determination of the attackers. Smoke rose from various points where fires had started, adding to the chaos and confusion of battle. The contrast between Mongol determination and Chinese desperation was evident in every aspect of the assault. Where the attackers fought with the confidence of proven superiority, the defenders struggled with the knowledge that their walls might finally fall to the force that had never known defeat. General Li watched in growing horror as his carefully prepared defenses began to crumble under the relentless Mongol assault, his elaborate armor now stained with the blood and soot of battle. The determination that had driven him since dawn was giving way to fear as he witnessed gaps appearing in his lines and Mongol warriors pouring through breaches that his engineers had sworn would hold. Behind him, Chinese warriors fought with desperate courage to hold their positions while civilians fled from areas of the wall that had been breached, their screams adding to the chaos of combat. Mongol warriors poured through gaps in the defenses like water finding cracks in stone, their curved swords flashing in the morning light as they cut down anyone who stood in their path. The officer's eyes reflected the weight of command and the terrible knowledge that he might be among the last to die in defense of his emperor's honor. Smoke and dust obscured much of his view, but the sounds of combat, steel ringing against steel, warriors crying out in pain and fury, the thunderous crashes of the battering rams, were clearly audible and growing louder. The myth of Chinese superiority that had inspired such confidence now seemed like a cruel joke as the walls that had protected his people for generations finally showed their vulnerability to the force that had swept across half the known world. The walls of Zhongdu, which had stood for generations as symbols of Chinese strength and civilization, finally gave way to the relentless Mongol assault at multiple points along their perimeter. Mongol warriors streamed into the city like a dark tide, their speed and mobility proving decisive against the more static Chinese defenses that had served so well in previous conflicts. Streets within the city showed Chinese soldiers forming new defensive lines with desperate courage while civilians fled toward the city center, seeking safety from the barbarian horde that now poured through their gates. Mongol horsemen rode through the breaches with the same fluid coordination that had won them victory across Asia, cutting down resistance with practiced efficiency while their commanders directed the assault with methodical precision. Individual heroic moments played out across the urban battlefield, Chinese officers rallying their troops for final stands that would be remembered in history, Mongol warriors cutting through resistance with the same skill that had built their empire, civilians protecting their families from invaders who showed no mercy to those who stood in their path. The city's layout became visible as Mongol forces spread throughout the urban area, and the contrast between organized resistance and chaotic flight was evident in every street and alley. Smoke rose from various points where fires had started, adding to the chaos and confusion of battle, while the sounds of combat echoed through the streets like a funeral dirge for Chinese civilization. Genghis Khan rode through the breached walls of Zhongdu with the same confidence that had carried him across half the known world, his expression showing satisfaction at victory but also the weight of command that came with ruling an empire built on conquest. His armor, stained with the blood of battle and dust of war, marked him as a warrior king who had proven his superiority against the finest army in China. Mongol warriors followed behind him with weapons ready and expressions triumphant, their confidence reflecting the myth of Mongol invincibility that had been tested and proven true in this very city. Chinese soldiers threw down their weapons and surrendered with the same desperation that had characterized their defense, while civilians bowed their heads in submission to the barbarian horde that now controlled their fate. The city's architecture showed the contrast between Chinese civilization and Mongol barbarism, but the Khan's presence emphasized Mongol dominance over both military and cultural achievements. His eyes reflected both the satisfaction of conquest and the calculation of an empire builder who understood that each victory was merely a step toward greater glory. Smoke rose from various points in the city where fires continued to burn, and the sounds of continuing combat echoed in the distance as pockets of resistance refused to accept defeat. The myth that had seemed uncertain at dawn was now proven beyond all doubt: the Mongols were truly invincible. Young Batu entered the conquered city of Zhongdu with a mixture of pride in Mongol victory and horror at the destruction that conquest had wrought, his young features streaked with blood and dirt from the day's fighting. The same confidence that had driven him through the battle now gave way to doubt as he witnessed the terrible cost of Mongol superiority, streets running red with blood, buildings burning throughout the city, and civilians cowering in fear from the barbarian horde that had swept away their civilization. Behind him, Mongol warriors celebrated their victory with the same enthusiasm that had characterized their assault, their cries of triumph echoing off the walls of a city that would never be the same. Buildings that had stood for generations now burned, their destruction testifying to the fury of combat and the ruthlessness of Mongol victory. The contrast between Mongol triumph and Chinese suffering was stark, and Bata's expression showed that he understood now what his elders had never fully explained, that the myth of Mongol invincibility came at a terrible human cost that few conquerors were willing to acknowledge. His sword hung at his side, still stained with the blood of enemies who had fought with courage and determination, but his grip on it had loosened as he began to question whether victory was truly glorious when it required such sacrifice. The complete fall of Zhongdu marked the end of Chinese resistance in this region and the final proof of Mongol superiority that had been tested but never truly doubted. Mongol forces controlled every street and alley of the conquered city with the same disciplined efficiency that had won them victory across Asia, while Chinese soldiers surrendered in large groups with the same desperation that had characterized their final defense. The imperial palace burned in the distance, its golden roofs blackened by smoke and fire, symbolizing the end of Chinese authority in this region and the beginning of Mongol rule. Mongol warriors patrolled the streets with weapons ready and expressions of triumph, their confidence reflecting the myth of invincibility that had been proven true through blood and steel. Civilians huddled in fear in their homes or fled toward the countryside, seeking safety from the barbarian horde that had swept away their civilization with terrifying speed and efficiency. The city's walls, which had seemed so formidable just days before, now stood as monuments to Mongol superiority rather than Chinese strength. Individual moments played out across the conquered city, Mongol officers taking stock of their victory with professional precision, Chinese commanders surrendering their swords with dignity despite defeat, civilians protecting their children from invaders who showed no mercy to those who stood in their path. Smoke rose from various points throughout the city where fires continued to burn, and the sounds of continuing sporadic combat echoed through the streets like a funeral dirge for Chinese civilization. Chinese civilians were led away as prisoners by Mongol warriors with the same efficiency that had characterized every aspect of the conquest, their faces showing fear and resignation as they understood that their comfortable lives were over. Children cried in their mothers' arms while elderly citizens struggled to keep up with the forced march that would take them away from everything they had ever known. Mongol warriors guarded the prisoners with weapons ready and expressions showing both triumph at their victory and contempt for the defeated enemies who had dared to challenge Mongol superiority. The city streets showed the aftermath of conquest, burning buildings that had housed generations of families, dead bodies of soldiers and civilians who had died defending their homes, and scattered possessions that spoke to the suddenness of defeat. The contrast between Chinese civilization and Mongol barbarism was stark, but the prisoners' expressions showed that they understood the reality of defeat and the price of standing against the force that had swept across half the known world. Individual moments of human drama played out among the captives, a mother comforting her child with whispered promises that might never be kept, an elderly man struggling with bonds that marked him as property rather than person, a Mongol warrior checking his prisoners' restraints with the same methodical precision that had won them victory. The imperial palace continued to burn in the background, its destruction symbolizing not just the end of Chinese rule in this region, but the crushing of the myth that civilization could stand against barbarian fury. Genghis Khan surveyed the conquered city of Zhongdu from his hilltop position with the satisfaction of a conqueror who had proven his superiority against the finest army in China, but his eyes also reflected the calculation of an empire builder who understood that each victory was merely a step toward greater glory. The city spread out below him in ruins, with smoke rising from various points where fires continued to burn and the sounds of Mongol consolidation echoed through the streets. Mongol forces moved throughout the urban area with the same disciplined efficiency that had won them victory, consolidating their control over the conquered population while Chinese prisoners were led away in large groups toward an uncertain future. Mongol officers reported on the victory's progress with professional precision, their voices carrying news of complete subjugation and the end of Chinese resistance in this region. The imperial palace stood in the distance like a monument to Mongol triumph, its golden roofs now blackened by fire and smoke but still visible as a symbol of conquest achieved. The Khan's eyes reflected both the satisfaction of conquest and the hunger for further expansion that had driven him across continents, his restless ambition already turning toward new challenges and greater victories. His horse stamped impatiently beneath him, sensing his master's desire to press forward rather than rest on laurels earned through blood and sacrifice. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been tested in open battle and proven true against the walls of the greatest Chinese city, but the Khan understood that legends were built not through single victories, but through the relentless pursuit of ever greater conquest. The Chinese emperor received news of Zhongdu's fall with shock and disbelief that quickly gave way to the dawning realization that his empire might be doomed, his elaborate robes and ceremonial headdress emphasizing his imperial status while his expression showed the vulnerability of a ruler facing the collapse of everything he was meant to protect. Court officials stood around him with expressions of fear and uncertainty, their confidence shaken by reports of complete defeat at the hands of barbarians who had seemed like distant threats just months before. Messengers delivered reports of the disaster with trembling voices, their words painting a picture of destruction that challenged everything the court had believed about Chinese superiority and Mongol limitations. The palace architecture showed the wealth and civilization of Chinese culture that had flourished for centuries, but the emperor's face reflected the fragility of human achievement against the force of history that now seemed to favor the barbarian horde sweeping across his lands. His hands trembled slightly as he received the reports, not from age or illness, but from the weight of responsibility for his people's fate and the knowledge that he might be the last emperor of a dynasty that had ruled for generations. The myth of Chinese civilization's superiority, which had inspired such confidence in the court, now seemed like a cruel joke as the force that had never known defeat advanced toward the capital itself. Young Bata stood among the ruins of Zhongdu with the weight of experience that no amount of stories around fires could have prepared him for, his armor stained with the blood and dust of conquest and his expression showing both pride in Mongol victory and the dawning understanding that such triumph came at a terrible cost. Behind him, Mongol warriors celebrated their triumph with the same enthusiasm that had characterized their assault, their cries of victory echoing off the walls of a city that would never be the same, while Chinese civilians suffered the consequences of defeat with quiet dignity despite their fear. The city's architecture showed the contrast between Chinese civilization and Mongol barbarism that his elders had always claimed, but Bata's presence emphasized that the conquerors were still human despite their legendary reputation. They bled, they suffered, and they made mistakes just like any other warriors. His eyes reflected both the satisfaction of victory that came from proving Mongol superiority against the finest army in China and the growing awareness that legends were built not on glory alone, but on sacrifice and suffering that few conquerors were willing to acknowledge. The myth of Mongol invincibility had been tested and proven true in this very city, but Batu understood now that such legends required human cost that made the stories told around fire seem pale in comparison to the reality of conquest achieved through blood and steel. The Mongol army departed Zhongdu with their prisoners and spoils of war in the same disciplined formations that had won them victory, leaving the conquered city behind as they marched toward new conquests that would extend their empire across the known world. The city's walls stood empty and damaged, their height and strength now serving as symbols of Mongol superiority rather than Chinese strength, their breached sections testifying to the fury of combat and the ruthlessness of barbarian victory. Mongol warriors rode in disciplined formations that reflected years of conquest and professional military training, while prisoners were led in chains with faces showing the reality of defeat and the end of comfortable lives they had known. The landscape stretched beyond the city toward the horizon like a promise of greater victories to come, emphasizing the vastness of the Mongol Empire and the endless nature of their conquest that had already swept across Asia and would soon extend into Europe itself. Individual moments played out across the departing army, Mongol officers checking their formations with methodical precision, prisoners struggling with bonds that marked them as property rather than people, civilians watching from a distance with fear and fascination as the force that had never known defeat marched toward their horizon. The sun beat down on the scene with the same intensity that had illuminated their victory, casting long shadows that emphasized the scale of Mongol achievement and the beginning of a new chapter in the legend that had been tested and proven true in the very heart of Chinese civilization. Genghis Khan rode at the head of his army as they departed Zhengdu with the same confidence that had carried him across continents, his expression showing satisfaction at victory achieved but also the restless ambition that drove him toward ever greater conquest and the expansion of his empire across the known world. His horse moved with the confidence of a warrior who had proven his superiority against the finest army in China, while Mongol warriors followed behind in disciplined formations that reflected years of conquest and professional military training. Chinese prisoners were led in chains behind the main force with faces showing the reality of defeat and the terrible price of challenging Mongol superiority, their comfortable lives now ended by the force that had swept away their civilization with terrifying speed and efficiency. The city's walls rose behind them like monuments to Mongol triumph, their height and strength now serving as symbols of conquest rather than defense, their breached sections testifying to the fury of combat and the ruthlessness of barbarian victory. The Khan's eyes reflected both the satisfaction of victory achieved against the greatest challenge his legend had yet faced and the hunger for expansion that had already built an empire stretching across Asia and would soon extend into Europe itself. His armor gleamed in the sunlight like a beacon marking him as a conqueror whose legend had been tested in the very heart of Chinese civilization and proven beyond all doubt, his restless ambition already turning toward new challenges that would further extend the myth of Mongol invincibility across the world. From a great height, the aftermath of the Battle of Zhengdu revealed the true scale of Mongol achievement and the beginning of a new era in world history that would reshape civilization itself. The conquered city stood visible in the center like a jewel in the crown of an empire that now stretched toward every horizon, its walls damaged but intact as symbols of a legend that had been tested against the finest army in China and proven rather than destroyed. Mongol forces moved throughout the region with the same disciplined efficiency that had won them victory, consolidating their control over conquered populations while Chinese prisoners were led away in large groups toward an uncertain future that would serve the needs of empire. Chinese civilians began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives under Mongol rule, their comfortable existence ended by the force that had swept away their civilization with terrifying speed and efficiency. The contrast between the disciplined Mongol expansion and the chaos of Chinese defeat was evident throughout the scene, where the conquerors organized their new territories with methodical precision. The conquered struggled to adapt to a world where their ancient civilization now served the needs of barbarian masters. Individual moments played out across the conquered landscape, Mongol warriors establishing garrisons to maintain control, Chinese civilians rebuilding their lives under alien rule, officials reporting to Mongol commanders with the same efficiency that had characterized every aspect of the conquest. The sun shone down on the scene with the same intensity that had illuminated their victory, emphasizing the scale of Mongol achievement and the dawning realization that the world would never be the same now that the myth of Mongol invincibility had been tested and proven true in the very heart of Chinese civilization. Genghis Khan stood atop a hill overlooking his vast empire with the satisfaction of a conqueror who had tested his legend against the greatest challenge the known world could offer and emerged victorious, his expression showing both the triumph of conquest achieved and the understanding that true legends are built not through easy victories, but through the most difficult trials that history can provide. Mongol warriors stood in disciplined formations below him with the same confidence that had carried them across continents, their belief in Mongol superiority now proven through blood and steel against the finest army in China and the strongest walls in the civilized world. The conquered city of Zhengdu lay in the distance like a monument to Mongol triumph, its walls that had never fallen now serving as symbols of superiority rather than strength, their breached sections testifying to the fury of combat and the ruthlessness of barbarian victory. The Khan's eyes reflected both the satisfaction of conquest achieved against the greatest challenge his legend had yet faced and the deeper understanding that legends are built through testing and triumph rather than granted by birth or destiny. His armor gleamed in the sunlight like a beacon marking him as a conqueror whose myth had been doubted but ultimately proven beyond all doubt, his restless ambition already turning toward new challenges that would further extend the legend of Mongol invincibility across the world. The force that had seemed uncertain at dawn was now proven to be unstoppable, and the world would soon learn that the myth of Mongol superiority was not just stories told around fires, but reality written in blood and carved into the very foundations of history itself.